thankful that you are joining us again, and we do have several new members. They may not be on the call yet, but I do certainly want to acknowledge the new members who are joining us for the first time, perhaps not at this meeting though. Mr. Kurt Dronbarger, who is with White County Schools, he's the Director of Schools. Ms. Robin Fairclough, she's the Director of Special Programs for Houston County Schools. Ms. Catherine Hare, which I understand she's not able to join us, she's with the Senate Budget. She is the Senate Budget Director, Office of Legislative Budget Analysis. And Ms. Lisa Myers, she's Finance Director for Coffee County Schools, and I did see her on the line. So a special welcome to you who are new to this. So thank you for joining us remotely. As you all know, we had hoped that we would be able to meet in person, and then there was a big event that occurred, and we're all probably tired of talking about it, but COVID-19 certainly has affected all of our plans. So thank you so much for being able to join us today. I will call on Nathan at this time to call the roll to establish a quorum. Nathan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Michelle Simcox.
Here.
Representative Mark Watson.
Patrick Boggs on the call. I don't know if Chairman Watt will be joining us. I'm trying to find out.
Patrick.
I don't know if anybody else is static, but it's hard to hear you.
After you answer, please mute your line. David Connor.
Here.
Senator Gresham, we got Michael Marin on.
Michael here for Senator Gresham.
Ben Torres.
Present.
Eddie Pruitt.
Here.
Chris Henson. Sarah Morrison.
Here.
Lisa Myers.
Here.
Penny Schwinn or designee.
Marianne Dursky for Commissioner Schwinn.
Commissioner Ely.
Greg Turner for Commissioner Ely.
Cliff Lippard. I've got you guys. I know you're on here. Larry Riding. Larry. Bob Eby.
Here.
Vicki Hall. Vicki Hall. Comptroller Wilson or designate. Anyone from the Comptroller's office? Robin Fairclough.
Here.
Dale Lynch.
Here.
Keith McDonald. The mayor's been in contact. I expect he'll join us shortly. Bruce Davis for Catherine.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, thanks, Mayor. Bruce Davis.
Bruce Davis here for Catherine Hare.
And Kurt Dronbarger. And Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Nathan. So we are duly convened with us having established a quorum. We're going to move into the statement of necessity that will be read by Nathan James.
Pursuant to Tennessee Code Annotated Section 491302A4B, the BEP Review Committee shall meet at least 4 times per year to regularly review the BEP components, identify needed revisions, additions, or deletions to the formula. In order to meet its statutorily required obligation to meet 4 times a year, the BEP Review Committee is to schedule a meeting for the 18th of June, 2020. Because of the pandemic and because members of the BEP Review Committee reside across the state, it was determined that a physical quorum of members could not be assembled in Nashville for the purposes of this meeting. As such, the BEP Review Committee met via teleconference on June 18th, 2020 to review data and discuss plans for the upcoming year. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Nathan. So now, without objection, I do want to state that the recording of our last meeting will serve as the minutes of this meeting. Without objection, so ordered. As we proceed with the agenda, I'm just going to ask if we can try this because I think we have all participated in virtual meetings where there have been some challenges with individuals talking over one another. So I'm going to ask you to state your name and that you have a comment or a question that you wish to make, just so that we can avoid talking over one another. And then I will just say your name after you said it to acknowledge that you are next up to speak. So I appreciate your indulgence with that because it can be quite annoying when someone's trying to talk and you don't know who it is. So now we're going to move into the depth of this agenda by starting out with number 4, which is a legislative update. I think everybody would agree that we certainly have had a most unusual legislative session. And with that, and as a result, we're going to ask Nathan to provide us with an update as it stands today. So Nathan, please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I am in the process of sharing my screen here. All right. Can everybody see that? I'm going to take that as a yes.
I can
Yes, we can see it.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Well, I should pop it over to the other screen, which has, everyone can see just the slide, is that correct?
Your name is correct.
Yes.
Yep.
Great. All right, so obviously the legislature is still in session. When we were first talking about how we would proceed this year, the idea was for everybody to get together in person around about the end of May, thinking that the legislative session would have been over. That's not quite the case. However, we have, in conjunction with the Department of Education, put together a lot of work to make sure that each of you are familiar with the bills that have passed in education. Keep in mind, at the beginning of a legislative session, typically there's anywhere between 350 and 400 bills related to education that are introduced in both houses of the General Assembly. This year, there's about 18 to 20 of those that will become law. The first ones I'm going to share with you were our State Board of Education legislative priorities. The first one, Public Chapter 629 by Senator Gresham and Representative Moody. This act expanded the list of offenses for which the State Board of Education must automatically revoke an educator's license. There have been, I'm trying to find my cursor here, there have been a number of changes made to the law regarding educator misconduct and what automatic revocation would, what crimes would trigger automatic revocation. And in the law as it stood, there were a number of gaps. For instance, arson was something that would make you lose your license, but aggravated arson wasn't. You had some child pornography offenses in there that were considered large enough to make it happen, and some that weren't considered large enough to make it happen. And so this bill filled in those gaps with some of the more egregious offenses like murder in the second degree, especially aggravated kidnapping, especially aggravated robbery, things like that. So House Bill 1974 allows the State Board of Education to seek reimbursement for the cost of proceedings in contested case hearings regarding educator misconduct. As it stands now, most other boards that regulate licenses can do that, but we can't. And so it really hasn't mattered how open and shut the case should be when, for instance, the evidence is overwhelming. Still, the taxpayer was always on the hook for every one of these contested case hearings. So with that change, it would allow the loser to pay in certain circumstances. All right, I'm trying to get it to change on the screen here. Not quite sure why it's not showing up there.
Nathan, have you tried the arrow keys on your keyboard?
Yeah, that's what I was using. There we go. Okay. The last one actually just passed, let's see, within this week, and that bill grants the State Board of Education administrative subpoena power for licensure misconduct investigations. This power was already enjoyed by some 25 other boards, including the Board of Podiatry and every LEA. So this extends that power to the State Board of Education. Public Chapter 527 by Senators Gresham and Representative Lafferty authorized the LEA to provide career-based opportunities to high school students, and it took down some barriers to creating partnerships with industry and local business. This was seen as something to enhance the governor's focus on career and technical-based education. The Public Chapter 532 allows for the sharing of questions used in the summative assessments used by the TDOE. And the formative assessment question banks also make sure that they would be available for use by the LEA. That's a change. Let's see. Is that one advancing? Can you see the next slide now or no?
Yes.
So on your screen, you're seeing PC 537 now?
Yes.
Okay. So these next three were simply sunset bills. One thing that most folks don't realize is that when the Tennessee General Assembly creates a part of government, it doesn't do so forever. Each thing that it creates has a sunset date, or a date by which it would cease to exist if the General Assembly does not make changes to it. And in this case, you see there's a sunset extension for the Advisory Council on Education of Students with Disabilities, Dyslexia Advisory Council, and the Southern Regional Education Compact. That's where SREB derives its authority. So Public Chapter 576, Public Chapter 576 requires the county legislative body to make revenue estimates and determine the level of revenue necessary to establish a budget for the operation of county schools, and effectively make sure that the maintenance of effort provisions are kept in place. So there's I'm sorry, I've got Michael. Are you on? Are you on the call?
I'm here, Nathan. Yeah.
Yeah. So the effect of this was to keep the maintenance of effort in roughly the same place, or what was there a considerable change that took place here?
What was the purpose behind this, and this came from the comptroller, is that we had school boards and county commissions disagreeing on incoming revenue and using that to set their budgets that were being sent to the funding bodies. And this was to help alleviate those disagreements.
Okay. I knew it hadn't been terribly controversial, and usually if it was, it would have gained a little more attention. This Public Chapter 587 defines the Grow Your Own Educator program, the partnership between an educator, prep provider, and the State Board of Education and one or more LEAs to coordinate a program for the preparation and licensure of teachers. Remember that we already have some other provisions which allow LEAs to become their own EPPs in effect, and we've seen that down in Rutherford County. They were the first to take this on during the last year. This next one just allows any students with an IEP to have the same accommodation for a TCAP or end of course exam, as long as that accommodation would not invalidate the validity of the test. So we had a lot of discussion this session on the alternative schools and This particular law authorizes the director of schools or their designee to decide whether to enforce a suspension or expulsion of a student that is transferred from another LEA. It requires a minimum suspension of more than 10 days before attendance in an alternative school is mandatory for grades 7 through 12, and it authorizes the director of schools or their designee to assign a student who has been expelled for committing a zero tolerance offense to an alternative school or program, and require the determination to be made on a case-by-case basis. Now, those provisions 1 and 2 were not in the original bill, and that represented some negotiations among some stakeholders so that it wouldn't be so stark and so that it wouldn't require necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach to it. Everybody seeing the next one, PC 618?
Yes.
So Public Chapter 618 represents an interesting situation. Senator Massey of Knoxville wanted to make sure that Knox County school system could actually relocate their administrative offices into a building that is owned by the federal government. And it was not authorized under the law until this point in time. The next one adds to the family life curriculum dating violence prevention. There are several other areas that are dealt with in the family life curriculum, and every year there's a couple of new provisions that are added. This year was dating violence prevention. Senator Swan, Representative Farmer came in with Senate Bill 2620, and this bill is still awaiting the governor's action, so he hasn't yet signed it. It's not entirely sure that it's going to be the law, but it clarifies that authorization for a director of schools to report a truant student to the juvenile court based on the plan being unsuccessful, that is truancy plan, and the school documenting the parent or guardian is unwilling to cooperate is not dependent on the school exhausting all 3 tiers of the plan. So they'd be able to declare that it's exhausted at an earlier point in time. It specifies that evidence of a parent or guardian's unwillingness to cooperate in the plan includes, but isn't limited to, repeated failure, refusal to attend conferences, return phone calls, attend follow-up meetings, or enter into an attendance contract. So truancy obviously is always an issue of consideration. Senate Bill 2888 is again awaiting the governor's signature. It's not certain that this will become law, but it requires each LEA and public charter school to ensure all school officials and other school personnel annually complete a child abuse training program and establish procedures for personnel to adhere to following the disclosure, discovery, suspicion of child abuse or sexual abuse. Now, the real issue that this was getting at is that it repeatedly traumatizes a student to have to go through the, talking about their sexual abuse. And what some school systems were doing is you'd have a conversation with the counselor and then with the principal, and they would be worried because of FERPA that they couldn't involve law enforcement on the front end. And so you had a lot of situations where students were having to tell the story over and over again, and as little details would change, it would cause a problem in convicting the perpetrator. So that's what this bill is seeking to alleviate. So the next bill, Public Chapter 628, by Senator Reeves and Representative Boyd, what it did was has TDOE and the Department of Health create one uniform form for students to register their various allergies. Apparently, there were different conflicting provisions of the law that had them reporting different sorts of allergies in different places. Public Chapter 651 was the Appropriations Act that was passed in March, but of course it's been later revised, so it's on the list, but there's no details there. So Public Chapter 652 is something that all of you superintendents are certainly quite aware of, as well as our folks on the State Board of Education. This is the legislation that authorized the State Board to create emergency rules to deal with all educational considerations brought on by COVID-19. Also granted some emergency rulemaking power. The other thing it did was allowed Higher Education Commission to make emergency rules as it related to the higher ed space, and it permitted the Commissioner of Education to grant waivers of certain rules and laws subject to the approval of the State Board of Education. And that's what much of what you're hearing from the department and the rules that we've undertaken, they've all been promulgated under this Public Chapter 652 authority. So Senate Bill 1616, again, this one awaits the governor's action. There's every reason to believe it'll be signed. Deals with the issue of teachers committing to a particular LEA. So it specifies that within 14 calendar days, if an offer is made to a teacher between April 1st and June 1st, including offers of employment, then they would have that period of time in which to give their response without being locked down and unable to go on to the next offer. And it changes that to 5 business days if that offer was made between June 1st and April 1st regarding offers of employment made after that point in time. I know that's a little confusing. Did any of the members or designees on the committee that worked on that bill that want to offer some clarity, by all means? So the next slide I bring you to is understanding the budget cycle in Tennessee. And the reason I specifically added this to the tail end of the legislative discussion here is so that we, again, understand why the committee, the BEP Review Committee, does some of the things that it does. As we know, the statute that authorizes the BEP Review Committee has us create our annual report by 1 November every year. But if you look at the budget cycle in front of you, you'll see that the planning and estimation and budget preparation process begins as early as July. So if we just bring our BEP priorities to the forefront on the 1st of November, we've missed every opportunity for the Department of Finance and Administration and the Department of Education to work those priorities into the budget document that they are pushing to the governor for his approval and eventually for him to introduce into the General Assembly. This is why we've undertaken our discussions and our survey process in the July and August timeframe, so that we're hitting the Commissioner of Finance and Administration, the governor, and the Commissioner of Education with the priorities of this committee at a time that's early enough for it to actually get into the mix. And that's why we've seen some real advancements as a result of that. I'm happy to take any questions. And if not, Madam Chair, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Nathan. I know there was a lot to cover and certainly a lot to digest for our members. Moving on in the agenda to the next item, which is a budget update. We have Greg Turner, who has agreed to provide us with the latest update that he possibly can share with us related to the budget. We do understand that the legislators are still in session, and it's my understanding they have not finally approved a budget yet. So, Greg, we certainly appreciate you doing this for us today. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, no problem. Let me go ahead and get my presentation on the screen.
Thank you. Sure.
Let me see. All right. You should be seeing a presentation now, fiscal year 2020-2021 budget. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Well, as Nathan pointed out, and I think was discussed earlier by some folks on the call, there was a budget passed in March, and that was commonly referred to as a no-growth budget. And at that point, given the unknowns about the length of shutdowns, the number of cases we would have, I think both the Senate and the House and the governor felt that the prudent direction at that point was to assume no growth in revenues in 2021. So at that point, a budget was passed, and it took out a number of cost increases that had been funded in the governor's recommended budget. Not all, but a number of those cost increases. And I think everyone understood that the legislature would have to come back at a later point and address additional changes to the budget based on revenue that the revenue collections that were going to occur in April and May. So the legislature has come back. They came back June 1st. And as noted, the Senate has passed their appropriations bill. The House has passed their appropriations bill. There are differences. So they are working through that process to come to an agreement on that final appropriations. So what I wanted to do with this presentation was not get into the details, but really kind of look at the big picture and sort of the parameters that I think both the governor and the Senate and the House are going to be working going from in 1920 and 2021 as well. So I'll go ahead and get started. And this is based off a presentation that Commissioner Ely did in front of both the Senate and the House Finance Committees. So for some of you, you've probably seen these slides before. The administration in their updated budget proposal, and I think both in the Senate and the House as well, they've committed to fully funding the BEP program, the growth and inflation cost increase that was submitted as part of that. They also committed fully funding pensions and health insurance, any debt service requirements that the state would be acquiring as part of the budget process, and also committed to having a structurally balanced budget. And the administration envision that as being a 3-year process. And what we talk about there with a structurally balanced budget is basically that your recurring expenses are going to be covered by recurring revenue. And so that's something that's really important to the rating agencies. Where states get in trouble is where you have a ongoing recurring cost that is being funded by a non-recurring revenue source. And so during, this year, next year, possibly into the next 3 years, we may be in a situation where we may be funding, quote, recurring expenditures with non-recurring revenue. What the administration has proposed is to get rid of that within a 3-year time period. The House, in their budget proposal, has reduced that down to a 2-year time period. And again, that's something that as the House and the Senate work through this process, depending on where that lands, we may be, that target may be within 3 years. That target may be for 2 years. So I'll go on. Again, this just shows the revenue that, as you can see, the economy was doing wonderfully up until April. We had great revenue growth. And of course, this was what we were basing many of the cost increases on that were in the governor's budget. Unfortunately, middle of March, the shutdown hit. April, the reason why that is so dramatic is part of the governor's proposal was to delay some of the taxes that were owed by businesses, that those would be delayed, that normally would be paid in April. He and the legislature ultimately allowed business owners to delay those. So that's why that 42% looks so dramatic. But again, in May, we had approximately a 15% reduction in tax collections. And so again, that's what, when the legislature returned and in working with the governor, that's what they're looking at is a significant reduction in tax revenue going forward. So on the revenue side, there was a state funding board meeting, and where they heard from various economists, and this is typically what happens each year before the budget is created. There's a state funding board meeting, and that really sets the ranges of revenue that the governor can use to budget, and ultimately the legislature can use to budget as well. So with the state funding board, there was pretty dramatic differences between estimates as to what our shortfall would be. For FY21, there was a estimate of a shortfall of $500 million, and to the highest being $1.5 billion. I think, again, this was 2 months into the process, and folks, the whole issue is how quickly will the economy bounce back? How quickly will people become comfortable with going out and eating at restaurants again and doing those social type of activities? So I think that's one of the reasons why you see this dramatic difference between the two numbers. Is it's just it's just difficult right now to see what the future holds from an economic standpoint. Whatever that shortfall is, of course, the state has to balance its budget. So we're not like the federal government where we can, as they say, print money. We have to balance our budget. So the approach that the governor has proposed, and again, I think this is something that both the Senate and the House has embraced as well. I think everybody understands the issue. Is basically we're going to be using a combination of cash, reserves that we have on hand, reductions to balance the budget over multiple fiscal years. And again, this revenue projection screen just shows you the various forecasts that were put forth. This is the 2021. I've been talking about that, but really we have an issue in 1920 as well. Closing out this fiscal year, I think there was a forecast somewhere between $200 to $700 million of being short this year as well. And so since we're so far into this fiscal year, really reductions is not an option to close that gap. So I think in this fiscal year, there will be emphasis on using reversion dollars coming from the agency. That's agency savings that they would generate in 1920. Reserves, what reserves would be eligible to be looked at is a topic of conversation going on right now, I think, between the House and the Senate as well. But again, so we've got to close out 1920, and then we have to deal with the shortfall in 2021 as well. I think this is a slide just to show the challenge that we will have in making reductions. I think the governor's recommended budget this year was just a little over $40 billion. However, if you break that down into state appropriations, which is the first line there, recurring appropriations, we have about 14.7 million in state appropriations. Once you start backing off programs that we want to hold harmless, that we do not want to touch, that we want to kind of take off the table, one of those being BEP, you get down to a discretionary base of around 6.8. And then if you take $1 billion off that, that would be about a 17% reduction off that discretionary base. So again, I think this slide was just to put in there to sort of show the magnitude of what a $1 billion reduction would look like going forward. So again, got to close the books this year in FY20. We have froze hiring and purchasing for the state agencies. And again, this year we will be looking at some non-tax revenues, some agency savings, and then reserves to close out the books for 1920. Again, the March budget that was passed included approximately $400 million in reductions to the initial governor's proposed budget. The governor, for the June proposal, cut out about another $284 million in those reductions. Again, depending on what happens with the House and the Senate and the budget that they finally pass, those numbers could change slightly. But again, I think everyone realizes that going forward, it's going to have to be a combination of reductions to the base and then efficiencies, finding current dollars that we can save as well. Addressing the deficit, again, the variables, what's the deficit going to be? A large difference between people who are saying it could be 500 million, it could be 1.5 billion, and how quickly the economy bounces back. What's the future tax growth going to look like? And then the levers that we have to try to manage this would reserve transfers, what we refer to as base reductions. That's reductions coming out of an agency's base budget, bonding some capital projects that had initially been budgeted as being cash up front, looking at bonding some of those. And then the rainy day fund, again, I think everyone is in agreement that the rainy day fund needs to be the last resource as we go through this process. I think I think everyone recognizes that we need to create as much savings as we can without going to the rainy day fund first. Again, long-term strategies, years 2 and 3. Again, the initial proposal by the governor was to balance the budget over a 3-year period. That could be reduced down to 2 years, depending on the final budget that comes out of the legislature. From an executive branch standpoint, we're going to continue to look for reductions and efficiencies. Utilize the rainy day fund and other reserves as necessary to close. And again, the rainy day fund will be the last resort as we work through this process. There was a commitment by the governor and by Commissioner Ely to work with the legislature as we look at budgetary reductions for agencies. We want to be as transparent as we can as we look at where we can reduce in agency budgets. A commitment to a structurally balanced budget, again, getting to a point where we're back to recurring revenues, recurring expenses being funded by recurring revenue. Fully funding the BEP growth and inflationary, fully funding contributions for pensions and health insurance, and then fully funding debt service requirements. That I went through that really quickly, and certainly if anyone has any questions, I'll do my best to answer those. So I'll turn it back over to you guys.
Are there any questions or comments for Greg?
Chairman Hargrove, this is Dale Lynch.
Yes, Dale.
Quick question regarding the BEP and the fully funding of the growth and inflationary information that you shared with us. Can you kind of give us, or Mary Ann, explain to us a little bit about what fully funding the growth and inflationary means, and how do you get that growth, and how does that inflationary number come, and exactly how much money is in the BEP for growth and inflationary money for this coming year?
Well, Dale, I would defer to Mary Ann on that, because she knows the details on that. From my perspective, when I say growth and inflationary, we will fund whatever the student growth that we are projecting for a given fiscal year, and then there are specific components of the BEP that have some built-in inflationary components to them. But I would certainly defer to Mary Ann for further clarification on that.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Greg. This is Mary Ann. Greg is right on point. Fully funding the growth in ADM means that we look at all of the students who are present in our schools in this current year, and then we use that number to fund next year. So we're taking current year ADMs, average daily membership, and using that to fund the upcoming year, which is historically what we have done. And on the unit cost, the inflation, we look at a number of unit costs in the BEP, things like materials and supplies, travel, equipment, textbooks, and we apply inflationary factors to them to inflate them up to FY21 levels using a series of deflator factors from CBER at UT Knoxville. And so we calculate those and we put those into our BEP budget, if you will, and that is what is funded. For FY21, the ADM growth and inflation comes to $58,018,000, and that's according to the most recent June estimate of the BEP.
Thank you very much.
Other questions or comments?
Madam Chairman?
Yes.
I just want to make the point, and first of all, I want to say thank you to Greg, both Greg and Marianne, because they've been a tremendous backbone to us. They're always helpful with all the information we need. And, you know, for members of the committee that haven't necessarily been involved in state budgeting or have been involved at other levels of government, when he talks about the reversion rate, you know, that is where an allocation is made to a portion of state government, an agency or whatever, and the expectation on our state's budget officers is not to run it right up to the edge, but to try to preserve what's necessary so that in a year like this, finance and administration can take that and plug it in where it's necessary. It may seem illogical, that is to say, entirely logical, but it's not done, certainly at the federal level. It's not done in a lot of places, and it's one of the reasons that our state has consistently been considered one of the best fiscally managed states. And frankly, that's been with Democrats, with Republicans, all sides together, and it's because of some of these budgetary practices. So in terms of staring at a budget that's, you know, you're looking at $1.5 billion in potential cuts, to take it this way is a whole lot less painful than many of the ways that it could be done, and it is being done, frankly, all over the country.
Nathan, thank you for adding that to this conversation. I know just, Greg, having you go through this presentation certainly was enlightening for me to understand the steps in the process, and certainly appreciate you pulling this together for us. So you made it understandable and very clear, at least in my mind. And Marianne, certainly thank you for your explanation too, based on Dale's question. Any other questions or comments from any of the members?
I'd like to thank Elizabeth for assisting me this morning. This is my first WebEx presentation, so she did a great job walking me through this.
Well, thank you. We appreciate hearing that. Elizabeth, thank you so much. I know several of us had some challenges this morning, so we really count on her so much more than most people realize, so thank you for that comment. Anything else from anyone before we move on to the next agenda item? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Greg. Appreciate that. Moving on to item 6, the TASER memo and AG opinion. Dr. Cliff Lippard. And while you're pulling up, and I don't know, Cliff, if you have any, I should call you Dr. Lippard, if you have any presentation materials, but I'll just give a little bit about what you're planning to do. So you are planning to give us some background information, as I understand it, on the TASER model, a bit of history, and some suggestions about how we move forward. And I know certainly during this conversation there may be an opportunity to tap into Marianne, but we certainly have her on the agenda if we need to keep it completely separate, but you certainly have the latitude to bring her in where necessary. So I'm turning it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Hargrove. And yeah, you're correct. And I believe my presentation material has been shared with the panelists. I just want to say, first of all, that it's good to be here with you all again this afternoon, even if here is still my dining room table. But what I'm going to do is I am going to go over the recent AG opinion related to our fiscal capacity model, and then I'm going to go over sort of the series of correspondences that led to that opinion. But first, I'm going to give a little bit of background, just a little refresher on the fiscal capacity model to give it some context. So,
Great, thank you.
of course. So the AG opinion that I'm speaking of is Attorney General Opinion 20-01, which opined that changes to the data sources in the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations fiscal capacity model must be adopted by the State Board of Education and approved by the Commissioners of Education and Finance and Administration. Legislative approval is not required for such changes, nor is approval of the P Review Committee. And this opinion was in response to a question that was posed to the Attorney General by TASR Chairman Representative Mike Carter, and that question was, whose approval is required for changing the data sources in the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations fiscal capacity model used to equalize funding through the Basic Education Program funding formula? So as you can probably guess, based on the question and on the answer, this all resulted from a disagreement and interpretation on who had the authority to make changes to the data sets used in our fiscal capacity model. And just again as a refresher, our model, the TASR model, shorthand, is just one of 4 steps used in determining BEP funding, and it's used to allocate local share among counties. It's actually, of course, just half the fiscal capacity formula that's used to do that. The other half being the fiscal capacity model that's been in use since 2007, that was developed by the University of Tennessee's Center for Business and Economic Research, or the CBER model for short. And our model is a multiple regression model and uses 3-year average data for 6 different variables. There's one dependent variable, which is own source revenue per student. And this is just the actual amount of money local governments raise to fund their schools divided by enrollment. So it's sort of a control factor that keeps the estimates within the bounds of what local governments actually do, what they actually spend on education. The dependent variables include sales tax base per student, which is locally taxable sales for the county area, divided by average daily membership, of course, a measure of the local ability to raise revenue. As is the next measure, equalized property assessment per student. A little bit more complicated. It's the total assessed property value to county area, equalized across counties using appraisal tills ratios, and then divided by ADM. And this variable that I'll be returning to in a minute, because there's a subset of this, which was the set in question that led to the Attorney General opinion request. Other factors include equalized residential and farm assessment divided by total equalized assessment. And this is a measure of tax exportability, the ability of the area to export their tax burden on to other people coming in from out of county to shop, etc. Then we have per capita income, which is a proxy for county residents' ability to pay for education, and for all other local revenue not accounted for by property or sales taxes, so things like wheel taxes and things like that. And then finally, ADM divided by population is a measure of service burden. It's a reflection of spending needs. The larger the number of public school students per 100 residents, the greater the fiscal burden for each taxpayer. So those are again, we use 3-year averages for each of these variables here in calculating our fiscal capacity index, which is done using a multiple regression analysis. So that property measure I mentioned, a part of that measure, one of the things that, excuse me, my slide is getting away from me. There we are. Part of the calculation that's used to come up with the equalized property assessment per student is what we call tax equivalency payments, or TEPS. And this is the estimated value of property that is subject to payment in lieu of tax agreements. Again, also called tax equivalency payments. And this is calculated by dividing the reported tax equivalency payments by the equalized property tax rate. This is not a perfect measure of those payments, or I'm sorry, not a perfect measure of the value of the property that could be subject to these payments. Typically, pilots are less than what the property value the taxable value of the property might otherwise be. In 2016, pilots were about 47% of the amount that could have been collected otherwise. But still, in theory, including TEPS increases equity in the model by helping ensure that no reduction in the property tax base is made based on agreements entered into by the local jurisdiction that result in payments in lieu of taxes being made to the local jurisdiction. And of course, language comes from Tennessee Code Annotated 49.3.307 A10, and it's one of the regulations in the code. Now, TEPS data was produced by Comptroller's Division of Local Finance as part of its County and Municipal Finances Report. Unfortunately, that report was discontinued in 1995. So this TEPS data has not been updated or available since 1995. So the 3-year average that's used in the model to this day is for fiscal years 93, 94, and 95. However, since 2007, there has been a measure of the value of this property available, also developed by the, calculated by the Comptroller's Office. In 2007, as part of the BEP 2.0 and the creation of the CBER fiscal capacity model, the Comptroller started collecting Industrial Development Board assessment data. And this data tells us the market value of government-owned properties, which can be determined, given a given property tax rate, the tax revenue that could potentially be generated if these properties were sold to entities that are required to pay property taxes. So in other words, if the government did continue to own it itself and allow its use by these businesses, but instead sold it to the businesses, and then it was subject to property taxes instead of just payments in lieu of tax. So the IDB assessment data, like I said, is used in the fiscal capacity formula that's produced by UT CBER, and it has been our opinion at TASER for some time that it should also be used in our model rather than the outdated TEPS data. Even before the IDB data was available, we had recommended changing the model to remove the outdated TEPS data. In a 2005 presentation to the BEPRC, TASER staff recommended removing that TEPS data from the model. There was nothing to replace it with at the time, but we just felt that the data was no longer sufficient and wasn't accurate anymore. So the issue was raised again as part of the discussions during Governor Haslam's 2014 Task Force on Education Funding. And again, here, TASER staff recommended that the more current data from the IDB data be used instead of the updated tax equivalency data. This became a formal recommendation from the Commission with our January 2018 report on industrial development boards, when our members recommended updating the fiscal capacity calculation to include the new IDB assessment data rather than continuing to use the tax equivalency data. And the report did say also that doing so would require a change in state law or recommendation by the BEPRC and approval by the General Assembly. Of course, as we've already seen in the Attorney General's opinion, that is not the case. But we'll go into a little bit more detail on that here in just a moment. So I'm going to pause for just a second to see if there's any questions on the fiscal capacity or anything before I start going through the correspondences. Good. All right, so and as a result of our Commission's recommendation in that 2018 report, I sent a memo on May 23rd, 2018 to Dr. Morrison and also to then Commissioner McQueen at the Department of Education to respectfully request that the BEP Review Committee consider our recommendation to substitute IDB estimates for the tax equivalency payments. My memo did note that the change would result in some counties seeing an increase in their percentage of state funding and others seeing a decrease. Any changes to the fiscal capacity model, it being a closed system, result in shifts where some systems gain and some systems lose. At the time, the Department of Education estimated that the substitutions would result in changes in state share funding ranging from a $433,000 decrease in Montgomery County to a $583,000 increase in Knox County. In preparation for this presentation today, staff updated those estimates, or updated the effect on our index and to show that the average of absolute change in percent of total fiscal capacity across counties from the substitution would be 1.7893%. In your material, Table 1, it shows what that change would be for each county area. But I can tell you that the largest increase would be for Bradley County at a 9.94% increase, and the largest decrease in fiscal capacity would be Trousdale County with a 3.39% decrease. So, of course, an increase in fiscal capacity generally means less, a larger local share and a smaller state share, and a decrease in fiscal capacity means a smaller local share and a larger state share. Now, the Department of Education, Marianne Dursky will be providing estimates of the effect on state funding shares from these shifts in index after my presentation, so I'm not going to go into that here. I'll let Marianne take care of that. All right, so so that memo was in again in May 2018, and after some discussion, the State Board and the Department chose not to take any action on responding at that time, but they did respond in August 2019 in a letter to our chairman, Representative Carter, and myself. And in that letter, they agreed that using the current IDB assessment amounts in the TASR model would reflect the most current data available and be more consistent with the data used in the CBER fiscal capacity model. They added that in their view, the BEPRC's authority to regularly review the BEP components as well as identify needed revisions, additions, or deletions to the formula does not cover changes to the data sources in our capacity model. And they suggested that we have the authority, we being TASR, to unilaterally make these changes without the approval of the BEPRC, and said that if we don't feel we have that authority, that we could seek passage of a law authorizing TASR to do so, to have such authority. So we discussed this with our members and our leadership at TASR because we were still of the opinion that we did not have the unilateral authority to make changes to data sources in our model. Now, I should clarify, the data itself, of course, changes every year. Data is updated with the most current data, and so those types of revisions are just part of what we're talking about, the actual changes to the data sources themselves, and that kind of comes up in the details of the Attorney General's opinion. But so after discussing these issues at our September 5th, 2019 meeting, our members voted to seek an Attorney General's opinion to help clarify the issues. So in a request dated October 28th, 2019, Chairman Mike Carter asked the Attorney General for an opinion on the question I noted at the beginning, which is whose approval is required for changing the data sources in the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations Fiscal Capacity Model used to equalize funding of basic education program funding formula. So in their response, their opinion, the AG noted that the Tennessee Code does not directly address the process for changing the data sources in the TASR fiscal capacity model. They did note that the State Board of Education must adopt, and the Commissioners of Education and Finance and Administration must approve the BEP formula, which includes the fiscal capacity models. And so they went on to say that any changes to the equalization formula must be adopted by the State Board and approved by the Commissioners. And they went on to say that because the TASR model is part of the equalization formula, any changes to the model must be adopted by the State Board and approved by the Commissioners of Education and Administration. Moreover, the data sources used in the TASR model should be considered part of the equalization formula. So therefore, any changes to the data sources must be adopted by the State Board and approved by the Commissioners of Education and Finance and Administration. They did note that elective approval is needed for changes to BEP components under the code, but since the data sources in the TASR model are not components within the formula, the provision for legislative approval is not applicable to changes in data sources. And they also noted that the BEP Review Committee, even though the committee has responsibility for reviewing the BEP formula and proposing changes to the formula, the BEPRC's approval is not required for actually making changes to the formula, including a change in data sources. So again, the final opinion was changes to the data sources in the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations Fiscal Capacity Model must be adopted by the State Board of Education and approved by the Commissioners of Education and Finance and Administration. Legislative approval is not required for such change, nor is approval of the BEPRC. So in short, we do not have unilateral authority to make these changes, but the BEPRC does not have to approve them, nor does the legislature have to, but it does have, changes do have to be approved by the Commissioners of Education and the Commissioner of Finance Administration, and they have to be adopted by the State Board itself. So at this time, I know that was pretty quick in the interest of time, but are there any questions?
Are there any questions or comments from members? I know that was a lot to digest. Of course, we did receive the materials in advance, and so I certainly do welcome your input, comments, questions.
Chairman Hargrove, this is Dale Lynch again with TOS. May I ask a question, please?
Yes, you can. Please proceed.
I do not have that document in front of me right now, but I did look at it before the call. And the way that I looked at it at the, I guess at the very bottom of the document, is it accurate to say statewide that this change would mean that there's a greater local burden to fund education and less of a burden on the state? Am I looking at that correctly?
I'll let Dr. Lippert answer. I believe he did say that in his response, but I'll let the expert respond to that.
So, no, as statewide, locals as a whole, the local burden would not change, but the burden would shift among the locals. So some locals would have a higher local share, and some LEAs would have a lower local share. But as a collective, it wouldn't change.
Does that clarify it for you, Dale?
Well, I was thinking that I looked at the very bottom of that document, and I understand that there would be some winners and losers, but what I looked at was at the very bottom where I thought that I saw, and I apologize for not having that right in front of me right now, but I actually thought that overall there was less money coming in from the state. Maybe I looked at that incorrectly, and I could be wrong.
This is Nathan. I'm looking at the same document. I think you're seeing a $1.423 million variance. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, sir. Yes, Nathan. Thank you. It was 1.4 million. What does that mean then? Can you help me understand that, please?
Hold on just a second. I'm calling up the document myself.
And I believe, isn't that the document that Mary Ann produced for us?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm going to let Mary Ann speak to her own document then.
All right, thank you. Thank you again, Madam Chair. Yes, what we looked at when we looked at an actual BEP calculation, we took the most recent June estimate for this upcoming fiscal year, FY21, and we used the June estimate that did not have the salary component increase in it. So just to set a baseline. And again, this is an estimate and a model, so nothing is cast in stone. But when we ran the model using the current TASR fiscal capacity indices that we use, the total BEP state share was $4.893 billion. When we ran it with the revised model, it was lower by $1.4 million. So the state payment was lowered by 1.4 million to 4,891 million. So there was an overall reduction in the state dollars that would go into the BEP. I don't know if you want to go further into the individual LEA implications now, or if we want to continue with questions for Dr. Lippard.
It's my opinion that we continue to have the questions be posed to Dr. Lippard, and if anyone wants to go into the granular details, I know it would be challenging from a timing perspective to do that. I think we can have a general discussion after we finish with questions for Dr. Lippard, that we could have a general discussion about the impact on the, just in general, because we do want to have a conversation about that.
Very good, thank you.
Other questions or comments for Dr. Lippard?
Madam Chairman?
Yes, Nathan.
So I want to, first of all, I want to thank Dr. Lippard. This had been an issue of, two organizations and two different sets of lawyers looking at a piece of code and not coming to the same conclusion on things. And so, but that having been said, you know that the folks that you're working with definitely have the best interest of children in mind. It's certainly not an adversarial situation. And that's very much one of the reasons that we're having the discussion today. So with that, I'd say Dr. Lippard and his staff have been certainly very helpful with the state board staff over time. But there's always going to be issues and considerations anytime you change a portion of the funding formula that affects dozens of LEAs, and so it's certainly a big thing moving forward, and I know it's on the minds of a great many folks.
There's certainly more than a dozen that would be negatively affected. I know you were just using that as an example. So I think it's important to note that and then to have a discussion about that, because this is important. We have to move forward. We have to make a decision. And it's not this committee making a decision, but I think it would be prudent for us to hear the voices of those of you who are on this committee. And we can certainly include this in our annual report if you make a recommendation that you want us to pass on to the state board, because clearly I think we're at a juncture as a state board that we're accepting this new the AG's opinion on this, that it is the state board's responsibility with approval from both commissioners of FNA and education. So the state board will have to take this up very seriously, but it is important to hear. And I think if you want to weigh in and provide it as a recommendation, we would include it in the annual report. Then we can share that with the state board. The state board will have to approve the change going forward. When I say approve, adopt, and then have the approval by the two commissioners. I know this is new for some of you, so if you do not want to weigh in, I completely understand, but we do want to hear your opinion if you're willing to share it.
Madam Chair, this is Ben Torres. May I ask a question?
Yes, you can. Please proceed, Ben.
Thank you. And Mary Ann, this is kind of it's a little bit moving over to your part, but so just looking at this document, for the districts that lose money, basically for the district to maintain the same level of funding, let's say this TASA recommendation was implemented, to maintain that same level of funding, then that would come from local sources. Would that be accurate? They would have to get additional money from local sources.
That is correct, because their state portion would decrease by the amount shown on the sheet in this model.
Okay.
Chairman Hargrove, Eddie Pruitt with a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
One thing that I would think would be beneficial in looking at this and making a recommendation would be to see what percent of the decrease is of the total budget of the district. If it's a small percentage of the total budget, that might make it easier to take that decrease. But however, if you're a small district and it's a huge percentage of your budget, then that would be something that would be very important to consider.
Thank you for that comment. I think we do need to look at it that way as well. The other thing too is that I think as a board, we certainly would want to seek options that may be available to us that would make districts whole. I certainly could not be the one to promise or guarantee that that would be an option for us, but I think we certainly would want to look at that and see if there is a way to make the districts whole and hold those districts harmless that would be losing funding if we were to proceed in the new fiscal year.
Madam,
yes.
This is Kurt Drumbarger in White County.
Yes.
I'm not sure if this question is directed to Dr. Lippert or Mary Ann, or maybe a combination of the both. But looking at that list, I find White County in particular, we would be in the top 10 of districts, I think, just glancing at this, of being affected negatively by this. And yet, most of that top 10 has a much more vibrant tax base than a county like ours. So just speaking on behalf of, folks that don't have that type of tax base, I think that's a considerable amount. It just happens to be in my county that I'm looking at, and there's others that are going to be seriously affected by that model. So I guess if there's a question in there, it's, could you go back over how that's being determined? Because I just see some other counties, districts much like myself, that, $100,000 in White County is a lot of money. It may not be in Hamilton County, but it certainly is here. And I can see that being the case for several other smaller districts that may not have it's not as easy to go back and get from extra local funds as necessary.
Well, and this change in Table 1 does not directly take into account the relative capacity of a White County to another county area. What this table is showing is the change in the capacity that would occur in the index that would occur if we replaced the 1993 through 1995 measure of tax equivalency payments with the more accurate measure and certainly more up-to-date measure from the IDB assessment data that the comptroller is preparing currently. So the difference is probably being driven, if there's a big percent change in any county area's capacity, that it's reflecting a larger difference between the old TEPS data, what they were paying in pilots back in the 90s, versus what the assessed property of that value is currently. So it's more the change in value of that property that's not on the tax roll than it is anything to do with the larger capacity of any area.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I appreciate that explanation.
Certainly.
Madam Chair, Bob Evie.
Yes, Bob.
Obviously, I can't speak for the Board of Education either. I can just speak from my point. So I look at this and look at the decreases. Some of those counties don't have the tax base to be able to make that up. And to me, it would be something that would take considerable look at. And as I read the opinion, it just means that we would adopt whatever model would be used. Doesn't mean that we have to adopt this model. And going back to what you're saying is that we would look to see, are there other options that might hold harmless or something in the near term? So I think this is something that would require considerable look at before we would take any action.
There's no question about it, Bob. We do, as a board, have to do our due diligence. We're 2 board members serving on this committee, so we're not in a position to make a decision for the full board. So we do have to do our extreme due diligence before we would move forward with any changes. Any other questions or comments?
Well, okay, this is David. I have a question. I guess for Mary Ann. This is about calculation of fiscal capacity and trying to get an understanding as to why it is that overall decrease in state funding of the 1.4 million. Is that considered a rounding issue, or how did that affect?
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you. I apologize.
I am as well.
Oh, may have a bad connection. I was asking how it is we end up, since this is just adjusting fiscal capacity, how does this affect overall the total amount of state revenues? Since it should just be moving fiscal capacity between systems.
Who can answer that question? Mary Ann, is that you?
I'm trying to think that through. The formula first calculates the total amount due that each county would, or each district would receive. And it then applies, it looks at the total amount, say for the instructional component. The local share of that is 30%. The total local share of that is 30%. And then each district's fiscal capacity is their share of that 30%. So it's total instructional times 30% times the fiscal capacity. And then the state share is determined by subtracting the local share from the total amount. So there were a greater number of decreases in the state share of, so I would assume that there were more increases in the local share just based on the change in fiscal capacity. But I have not analyzed it deeply enough to give you a solid answer on that, and I apologize.
If I may, Chairman Hargrove,
Yes,
I'm having a little side email conversation with our senior policy coordinator and former executive director, Lenise Workpatrick, who I think has a theory on what might be happening there. If I can throw her under the bus, Lenise, do you want to?
Please, please proceed. You're fine, as long as she doesn't have any objection.
Are you still on there, Lenise? There we are.
Hang on just a sec. Let me. Can you hear me now?
So I had asked Lenise as well as Lynn Holliday, who's another one of our senior consultants, and Melissa Brown, our deputy executive director, to be on here, just in case I did drive into a ditch, they could tow me out. So this is Lenise jumping in.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Lenise. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Okay. I apologize for not having a camera on my computer. I was just asking a question of Cliff and staff that I thought they might be able to answer. I'm sure Mary Ann can if she's got a chance to look at the data. But my first thought was there are floors in the fiscal capacity formula on the non-classroom side. Is that still correct? And I was wondering whether, because Davidson and Sevier counties, for instance, have a decrease in fiscal capacity, perhaps what's happening is that floor is not costing quite as much?
That is entirely possible. Although it looks like both Davidson and Sevier had very slight decreases in their fiscal capacity.
Which would increase their state funding, correct?
Right,
it would change
yes.
their share from that
very
non-classroom
slightly.
side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The other thing that does come into play when we run the calculation is minimum funding, which is sort of the old hold harmless. And so districts that fall below what they would have generated in 2016 as adjusted for loss of ADM, that becomes a sort of their floor below which we don't fund them. And so that may have played into this as well, if some of these districts fell way below their floors or their hold harmless levels.
Any comments regarding that or other questions or comments? I know we're getting very tight on our timing, and we may have to ask if you all are willing to stay on longer, but let's just finish up to make sure. Any other
Chairman,
comments? Yes, please.
Linda Wesson from the Comptroller's Office.
Yes.
I had a question for, would be more of a implementation issue, is if you're currently using a 3-year average of the old TEP data, if you switch to the IDB, what is the possibility of switching slowly? So 2 years of TEP, 1 year of IDB, then 1 year of TEP, 2 years of IDB. I know it's not, we all agree that 1995 data is not good, but what does that do in terms of an impact to the district?
Well, that's certainly something we could look at, Linda, and it's consistent with one of the main reasons we use 3 years of data, which is to smooth out large changes so that so we don't have big spikes in capacity in any given system from 1 year to the next. So it's something we could certainly model.
I would think we would want to look at that data. Does anyone disagree? Oh, and you're free to disagree, please. Just because it's me.
We're happy to run that and provide that information to you at whatever time works with your time scale.
Does that seem reasonable to everyone else, that we should do that?
I think Bob Eby, sorry.
Yes, Bob.
Definitely. I mean, I think we ought to look at that model, recognizing again right now that we're going through the COVID. I mean, there's significant changes here, so any impacts are going to make a significant, could make a significant impact on a district. So I think we ought to look broadly at what makes the most sense. I think we all agree using 1995 data is not the right thing to do. But let's look and see what we can do to minimize the impact, and it may be that model, it may be some other model.
Correct. I do agree with that. Any other comments?
Yep, Madam Chair,
yes, Nathan.
Just reminding the BEP Review Committee as well, it is good and useful and appropriate to have the conversation, and certainly we've wanted to get the legal framework in which that will work. But I mean, to be quite clear, the reason why this hasn't been changed for so long, regardless of who had authority at what point in time, is because it creates winners and losers amongst the districts. Right. And it is that is to say, it's going to be a factor, and it is going to, for the Board of Education, the State Board of Education, to appropriately consider, every consideration will have to be made with the Department of Finance and Administration, the Department of Education, and eventually with the General Assembly, because it's possible that they may want to make some change in the appropriations document. So we just need to create the appropriate expectations in our mind and in our discussions here about the limitations that this discussion has, because while the Attorney General points out the authority is with the board, yet at the same time, it is as much with the administration, and all of that authority is delegated by the General Assembly. So we just remember, whatever this committee comes up with doesn't necessarily indicate how the change will be.
Nathan, as always, thank you for the clarification and shining a light on the way that this is. And we know that we as a board can suggest, and I say board, the state board can suggest what should be adopted. Again, we know we are not the approving entities for that. And so this committee, I think, can provide input and help us look at data from different perspectives and make sure that we consider the options that are not just what's before us today, but something perhaps we've not considered yet. So I think it's important to still be able to have that conversation. Let me ask, because we said we would conclude this meeting at 3:30, and when you look at the agenda, there are certainly some critically important other topics that we would like to discuss. So we've not really fully, and we wanted to give Mary Ann certainly more time and you all to ask questions of her. But with 3:30 almost literally upon us, is it your preference to conclude this call at 3:30 and in our next meeting, which is likely to be early July, continue the discussion and go more deeply and have good, solid amount of time to talk about our priorities? Because that's something, we typically would conduct a survey in sometime early July, but we do not want to conduct a survey without having a rich discussion among the members to determine and have a clear understanding from each person's perspective what might likely be new priorities or returning priorities with some additional priorities. So with that being said, I don't want to sell that short. Is there anyone that has to go off the call promptly at 3:30? Let me ask that question first. Okay. Can you stay with us until 4 p.m.? If the answer is no, just say no. So it looks like we're good to continue until at least 4 p.m. and I appreciate your indulgence in that. So I'm going to go back and just one last time, anything else for Dr. Lippard before we ask if there are any other things that Mary Ann wants to share with us with regard to the numbers that she has produced for us. Okay. Mary Ann, is there anything else you want to point out and share with the committee? We have your spreadsheet, but I don't want to sell you short on anything you want to point out to the members.
Thank you. I really don't have much to add. I think in our discussion, we have touched on the points that I was going to make, just pointing out, as you can see from the spreadsheet, that there are some very significant shifts in funding from districts that gain $1 million or close to, and districts that would lose $1 million or close to. So while some are very minorly affected, there are some who are very significantly affected in terms of dollars. And as was pointed out, even a smaller dollar amount can be a very significant shift to a district depending on the overall size of their budget. And so what I can do until we meet again is go through and look at this as a percentage of BEP loss and a percentage of their estimated budget loss, and give you those numbers to see the gains and losses from a different perspective.
I will not speak for all the members, but I personally would prefer that would certainly welcome you doing that. I would imagine that some of the directors of schools that are on the call that are members of the committee would want that as well. So thank you for offering to do that for us.
And we're happy to. We're happy to provide that.
Great. Dr. Lippard, did you have any other comments you wanted to make for the group? And I certainly want to thank you both for the work that you do. And there's no way we could do this without the information that you share with us. So just one last opportunity. Anything before we move on to the next agenda item?
No, Chairman, I don't have anything else to add. Just we will go ahead and take a look at that more phased-in approach that was mentioned and run some numbers on. We've been talking extensive. Our staff's been working with Mary Ann on this, and we'll continue to do so.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Moving on to item 8, the discussion of potential priorities. I'm going to turn it over to Nathan to lead us through this discussion. Critically important, as I said earlier, to our future survey and to have this discussion so we have an idea what's on your mind and the areas where you think we should potentially change components of the BEP and or ratios.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I will say from the legislative update at the very beginning, there was one piece that I forgot because it passed the House floor last night, and that is there will be created a commission on educational recovery and innovation that will consist of 3 members appointed by each speaker and the governor. And that is being created with long-term concerns. In other words, the 5 and the 10 years later, what will have changed in education as a result of this COVID-19 situation that we're in. What I would like to do now is to ask the members of the BEP Review Committee to, I mean, we know what our priorities have been over the last several years, and they're awesome priorities, you know, and some of the wins with getting the 11th and 12th month of insurance paid for, RTI squared in the formula, doubling the computers portion. All of that is big, but wanted to make sure that the members get a chance to say, all right, what is a priority maybe that others haven't thought of in a time like this, so that when you all do take the survey later on, you can have your colleagues' ideas in your mind. So with that, we can just go straight through and start calling folks out unless we get some volunteers, but we certainly want the input now from our board members. I've got Vice Chairman Eby on my screen. I've got Mayor McDonald, and I would say let's give it a shot. Who would like to go first?
Nathan, this is Dale. Can I go ahead and go?
Yeah.
I don't think there's any. I don't think there's any question that I think most of our directors and superintendents would tell you there's never been a bigger need for school nurses right now and mental health counselors as we move into what the school year is going to be like. I know that we've talked about that before, but COVID just made it that much more important.
This is Michelle Simcox. I definitely agree with what Dale just said.
Yeah, this is Kurt Drumbarger in White County. I agree. That was the first thing that came to mind. You know, it's come up year after year in General Assembly and seems to get pushed down each time. And, you know, I know White County is funded for 1.26 nurses. We have 8 schools and 4,000 students. So that's definitely a need.
So this is Mayor McDonald. I agree with the school nurses and counselors. I also would like for us to consider how we might address the governor and the General Assembly on this matter of SRO officers in the schools. They put $30,000 in for each position, but there wasn't a lot of flexibility with that. So with that amount of money, we actually could, with the amount they were offering for the school system our size, they were offering us about $120,000, but they said each $30,000 had to be for a separate officer, and it cost us almost $100,000 per officer based on their equipment needs and all the training and everything per year. So I'd like for us to be talking about the security part of this in SROs and other parts, and how we work with the money that was set aside in a way that we actually could afford to do something in some of our more expensive cost of living areas.
Well, the mayor's also made the point at a couple legislative committees. Certainly, we've run into each other because some of that SRO legislation it didn't really give any credit to the local governments that had already taken it on their own initiative. And so, yeah, there were certainly some shortfalls in that. And SROs and school security and safety issues have certainly been on our priority list for a number of years.
Nathan, Bob Eby.
Bob.
Yeah, I would like to hear from the districts their thoughts with regard to technology devices and technology access as a priority. I think each of the districts are doing some kind of surveying to see what kind of access and technology is available within their individual districts. But is this something that should be high on the priority based on virtual learning, et cetera?
This is Eddie Pruitt, Director of Gibson County. I would say technology is a big one, especially with what we're looking at. We can't afford to go one-to-one, or even if we did go one-to-one, we could do it 1 year, but then what do we do when it's time to redo those? So it's that ongoing cost. And I think Mary Ann could probably correct me on this, but I think we get $40 per kid for technology. So, our budget for technology is ever increasing, but the amount that we get per kid for technology is not.
That's a great point, Eddie. And I mean, it's interesting because even now, when the need is so much more, so much greater, then we're still seeing the priorities that we have used come up over and over. Other members, we've got a few new members on the committee. Robin, are you still with us?
I am.
I know you bring a unique perspective. I certainly wanted to hear what you might have for your colleagues.
Well, I was going to say, where my heart is our at-risk learners our gaps have gotten bigger due to school closures. And we're going to have some way to address, our students with disabilities, our ELL learners, our youngest learners, that virtual opportunities are not meeting their needs. And so we're getting a bigger gap with our haves and our have-nots, and I'm not sure how we're going to address those.
Lisa Myers.
Hello. I agree with everything that has been suggested. It's certainly all of these components are a struggle for us. I want to add a little bit of, let's call it old school, and talk about textbooks a little bit. Compared to what we are budgeted with BEP, our textbook budget is over double. In addition to nurses, social workers, those type of positions, we are also greatly underfunded in assistant principals. For 10 schools, we're only funded for 3 assistant principals system-wide. So I would like to throw that into the mix of positions that, we feel are underfunded.
And can I echo on what Lisa just stated? With our principals and assistant principals, majority of those are 11 and 12 months. So I think that should be taken into consideration as well.
Well, is there any other member that wishes to speak up on it? We just wanted to make sure everybody had a chance to say what they needed to say before you get your survey every year. It sounds like the survey, just listening to this conversation, every bit of what we've talked about has shown up in the last several years. I guess with the exception of the textbook budgeting, the rest of the issues that have come up have made the top 5 list. And for our new members, what we'll do is we'll send out a survey and you put in your top 5 priorities. And then we amalgamate those and we take the top 5 and then we'll present them back to the committee. The committee agrees, yeah, this is what we voted on. And we do a letter to the Commissioner of Finance and Administration and the Commissioner of Education, the Governor, saying these are our priorities. And remember, from what we went through earlier, you saw that circle with the budget cycle on it, right? And so that we can get it in a time frame where we could actually win on this stuff, right? Instead of just saying we want $600 million that doesn't exist when it's well past the point in time that we could get into the conversation. So I think if anyone else wants to make a point on that, we'd welcome it. And if not, I think this was a good discussion.
Hey, Nathan, this is Keith McDonald again. On the at-risk learners, before filling out anything on a survey with that, so much of that money seems to come from the feds instead of the state. I'd like to see some explanation in terms of the funding from the state versus the funding from the feds.
So let me ask this: is that something that the department, maybe in conjunction with Robin, is that something that you and the department could work on in terms of perhaps the next meeting, so that all of the members could get a breakdown of the funding sources? Is that something you all would be comfortable with taking on for the next time we come together?
I could reach out to the department because I would assume that they could look, like I know for my county, I could look at my GP special ed budget and compare it to my IDEA, my federal one.
Right.
And I would assume that the state has a mechanism to look at that for all districts across the state. So I can reach out to them and see if I can get the breakdown of that.
Yeah, this is Mary Ann. Yes, and we'd be happy to work with you, and we can also provide the amount of at-risk funding that is generated through the basic education program funding as well. And then we have the Title I information, IDEA, and so forth.
I think that sounds great.
So then, Nathan, with that being said, when we meet the next time, we would want that information to be shared with us before we actually conduct the survey. Would you say that sounds correct? Okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
I guess the question becomes for members, and this sort of leads into the process for the rest of the year. Would members want to just receive that information, or do you want us to use one of our 4 meetings to come and present that prior to sending out the survey? Keeping in mind, I need us to reserve 2 meetings for right around the end of October, November timeframe for the purposes of approving the report that we're statutorily required.
And Nathan, as a new member, can you kind of clarify, when you're talking about a survey, is there an expectation to get like stakeholder feedback before completing the survey, or?
So that's entirely at your discretion. The members of the committee are appointed pursuant to a lengthy description in the law that says that we need 1 member from this category and 1 from this category, and so on like that. You're not required under the law to do that. It's certainly great for you to have conversations with other folks. But ultimately, the State Board of Education, when considering whether to appoint you or not, views you as a representative expert, I guess is a good way to look at it.
Okay, thank you.
Nathan, this is Bruce. I have a suggestion as far as the impact of the survey item, dollar impact of estimating the survey items. Perhaps that might be best to be shared at the time with the survey to help us determine rankings.
Sure. Now, so in other words, what you're thinking is we conduct the survey, we figure out what the top 5 are, then attempt to get estimates of how much each one would cost, and then we have a discussion about whether they make the list or not. Is that correct?
No, I think we ought to get estimates on the cost before we do our survey.
So the only downside with that is that we couldn't possibly ask the Office of Local Finance folks at the department to run a cost analysis on a potentially limitless number of responses. So, I've got a pretty good guess about what people will say, but I will tell you this, every single year there's at least 5 or 10 that I never thought of that made somebody's list. You see what I'm saying? And so it becomes a little difficult to do an analysis of all of them in advance. Whereas when we get to the point that we're going to put it into the report, the data from the districts has come in for the next school year, which is one of the reasons why we get this thing done in August. We have to wait until some of that stuff comes in. It doesn't come in until October. And then we can have the analyses done and say, okay, we expect it'll be somewhere in the neighborhood of $46 million or $107 million or $35 million or whatever. So I don't know how practicable that would be.
Nathan, this is Keith McDonald. In that regard, if we're able to do the survey so that we have like the 5 top and then maybe 2 or 3 fallbacks, simply because if then we get the information and clearly the ask is going to be too great to make the budget, it just won't be feasible to get that kind of money, then we would have others we could fall back on and say, okay, we can't do that one of the 5 because the cost is unrealistic in this particular time that we're in. Is that something we could possibly do so that we've got, as we add this cost factor to it, we've got some other information to fall back on?
Mayor, I could easily add, okay, number 6 was this, number 7 was that, and number 8 was this. We could certainly do that. That would be no problem. And that would also limit the scope because I'll tell you what, Mary Ann and her crew are amazing folks. And as much as we think they're amazing, so does everybody else in the whole state. They're always asking her to do 800,000 things. And so, yeah, if we can limit those requests, then that's a little more likely. I'm more than happy to include that if, Madam Chair, if that's permissible to you.
Well, Nathan, before we do, yes, that would be fine. But one of the things that I do want to state, for those that are new and those that are returning, in the past, we've also had the information shared with us by different people who would be considered to be experts. And Robin, as a matter of fact, you provided us with a very comprehensive report last year that we included in our annual report where you were actually making recommendations regarding ratios. And so I think even knowing and understanding what you would be recommending in the survey is critically important, and then knowing what the impact is of increasing a ratio from 1 to 250, whether it's counselors or whatever because I'm not looking at the data, I'm just speaking off the top of my head. But if you were to suggest the ratio should be 1 to 100 or 1 to 200 or whatever, then we have something to go on and something to run some calculations on. And I think where we get input from those of you that are in the field who know better where you are having a shortfall and how many you're suggesting, because you started out saying, and most of you were in agreement, that we need to improve the ratio of nurses to students. And so what should that number be? It wouldn't just be, let's increase that number. What should that ratio be? And I would want to hear that, if that makes sense. Nathan, do you?
Yes, ma'am. What we've done in the past is we have the top 5 list. In the case of nurses, what we'll do is we'll propose language in the report or language in the letter that goes to the governor and to the 2 commissioners that says something like get a number closer to the national best practices number, which is 1 per 3,500 or 1,500, whatever the number is, depending on the discipline. And some of the thought process that has gone into that in the past is that it allows F&A some flexibility, that if they can't quite hit the best practice number, they can at least increase it considerably over where we are. And so some of the ways that we phrase those things is, this would be best, but we're asking for it to get better. It's defined for you if you'll take it, but we're not saying that we want all or nothing. And so, yeah, those presentations are certainly helpful. And ultimately, if you'll look at the BEP report for the last several years, you will see national best practice numbers listed in nearly every case. But we leave it to F&A, we leave it to the General Assembly to say, okay, from our pot of money and our revenue figures are like this, we can carve out another 40 million here or another 20 million here to make this happen. Even if we can't get all the way, we'll get part of the way.
What else, Nathan?
I think it's been a great discussion. I'm happy to conclude it at that.
I think we're good to conclude it and then go into getting ready for adjournment. I want to thank each of you all for staying with us longer beyond the time we had set aside for this meeting. And thank you for the great discussion and the questions and comments that you all shared with us today. I cannot underscore enough how much I appreciate your commitment to serving on this committee. I know that you have other things going on in your daily lives, and so now more than ever, especially with COVID-19, your participation is extremely invaluable to us in this process. So thank you all very much, and without objection, we stand adjourned. Thank you. Y'all have a good rest of the day.